Well, welcome to budget presentation that we have for you tonight. We're going to talk about the Badger BounceBack Budget presented by Governor Tony Evers for the 21-23 state budget. And so we're going to start right now with our first slide. And of course, Governor Tony Evers and I, to start with, I want you to know that I made a lot of recommendations to Governor Tony Evers for this budget, and I'm really thrilled that he took some of our recommendations to heart. And we're going to move on to the next slide. And this slide shows you exactly where the money comes from. The pie chart on the left is all the different streams of funding that feed the entire state budget. We have the general purpose revenue, also known as GPR. It's money that has no strings attached, and the state can budget it for any purpose. The federal revenue is money that usually has a lot of strings attached to it. Example would be federal highway funding or Medicaid dollars. The program revenue generally consists of user fees that are collected by the state for certain programs, and examples of that might be UW tuition or state fair park admissions. And then there's the segregated revenue, which is kept entirely separate from the general fund and is similar to program revenue that is typically only used for specific purposes. Example might be hunting and fishing fees or gas tax. Now, the general fund pie chart on the right is a closer look into that general fund and where the state revenue comes from. GPR funds include individual income taxes, state sales taxes, corporate income taxes, and other smaller sources. But I also want to be sure to know that this budget does not include Wisconsin's share of the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan Act that President Biden and Congress has recently approved. That funding will go towards stimulus checks, vaccine distribution, economic relief efforts, and direct aid to local schools and communities. Our next slide tells us where the money goes. And so the general fund, we'll see is that this is where what we spend with our general purpose revenue. No strings attached money. I want to remind you of that. Looking at just the 2023 fiscal year, the governor's GPR budget is $21.1 billion, with the vast majority of that going to education and healthcare. When you break down the GPR budget by purpose, roughly half goes back to local communities. A little over a quarter goes directly to individuals, and less than a quarter funds state operations, including the UW system and corrections. Finally, we're going to get back to the balance that it should be, with UW system dollars being greater than correction dollars this year. Now, all funds, which is not pictured, this is every dime of the state spends, whether it is from the feds, from programs, from taxes, all spending. The total all funds budget for the state in the governor's budget or proposal is $45.4 billion in fiscal year 22 and $45.6 billion in fiscal year 23. Again, when you look at the major items in the all funds budget, nearly 75% of all spending goes to healthcare, education, UW system, and transportation. Even despite the ongoing COVID pandemic and economic turmoil, Governor Evers' budget is projected to close with a positive gross balance of $142.7 million at the end of fiscal year 23, if everything goes the way we expect. The next slide is tax relief for those who need it. It's no secret that the pandemic has had a disproportionate effect on our economy, with many low and moderate income families hit hardest financially. So in his last budget, Governor Evers cut income taxes by over $400 million, with the vast majority of that, 87%, going to taxpayers with annual incomes below $150,000. This budget would continue that trend of targeting tax relief to those who need it most by prioritizing a new caregiver tax credit to help those caring for adult family members, an increase in the earned income tax credit. Under the governor's budget, over 200,000 filers with children will receive $74.3 million in fiscal year 22 and $74 million in fiscal year 23. Also, an increase in the homestead tax credit and indexing it to inflation moving forward. That will provide an additional $69 million in homestead tax relief over the next 2 years. Also, a new state child and dependent care tax credit similar to the federal tax credit. This would provide nearly $10 million in tax relief annually for approximately 106,000 taxpayers. Also, an expansion of the veteran and surviving spouses tax credit for renters. Well, the governor's budget also includes targeted tax relief boost for our economy, like the new work opportunity credit, which would provide tax incentives to employers who hire individuals facing barriers to employment, such as veterans, justice-involved individuals, and TANF recipients. Our next slide is about eliminating tax breaks for millionaires. The amount of M&A, well, first of all, let me just tell you that you've heard about the Wisconsin's M&A tax credit. That's a manufacturers and egg tax credit, which virtually eliminates income tax liability for manufacturers in Wisconsin. It was slipped into the 2011 budget at the last minute without a public hearing as a handout to big business special interests. Companies that do not need to create new jobs to get that tax credit, even businesses that send jobs overseas, lay off workers, and close factories can claim the credit. The overwhelming majority of this tax cut, 84% of it in fact, goes to individuals making more than $1 million a year. And more than half of that was to taxpayers making over $5 million a year. As you can see in the chart on the right, the amount of M&A funding that goes to 1,180 individuals earning over $1 million a year is more than all of the combined earned income, homestead, and veteran and surviving spouse tax credits for seniors and working families. Well, capping this tax credit will generate approximately $485 million in revenue over the next 2 years, which is the intention of Governor Evers' budget. Additionally, Governor Evers' budget would eliminate the 30% long-term capital gains exclusion for individuals who make more than $400,000 and joint filers who make more than $533,000. The move will generate about $350 million in new revenue. Wisconsin is one of only a few states that gives preferential treatment to income earned from investments, also known as capital gains, taxing that income at a lower rate than income earned from working. Our next slide, that too many Wisconsinites face barriers accessing health care, and for a variety of reasons. The governor proposes to expand Badger Care to provide coverage to approximately 90,000 of Wisconsinites and save more than $630 million in state tax dollars, which are reinvested into critical healthcare initiatives. We were initially expected to draw down an additional $1.3 billion from the federal government over the biennium, and on March 9th, the Nonpartisan Legislative Fiscal Bureau confirmed that under the Federal American Rescue Plan Act signed on March 12th by President Biden, Wisconsin could receive an additional $1 billion, that's billion with a B, in federal funding if the Badger Care is expanded. These funds could be reinvested to improve the health and well-being of all Wisconsinites. That's why we keep talking about Medicaid expansion. It is something that we as a state need right now. States that have not expanded Medicaid, like us, have fallen behind the rest of the country, causing the closure of rural hospitals and less access even for insured residents. The governor's budget protects patients by requiring health insurance providers to guarantee the issuance of health insurance to individuals that apply for coverage regardless of pre-existing conditions, sexual orientation, gender identity, health status, or medical history. Balanced billing or surprise billing continues to affect too many people to no fault of their own when receiving emergency medical services or even services at an in-network facility. To stop this unnecessary and fiscally harmful practice, the governor recommends eliminating surprise balance billing for ambulatory and emergency services. The governor's budget also reduces barriers to utilize telehealth services for private and public health plans by establishing parity provisions to ensure patients are treated the same as if they received an equivalent in-person service. This will increase the availability and affordability of telehealth services. The next slide talks about improving prescription drug affordability. The high cost of prescription drugs continues to place a financial burden on too many Wisconsinites. People shouldn't have to choose between cutting back on household expenses like food and utilities or foregoing critical medications just to make ends meet. Just on the chart on the left tells you over the last 20 years, the prices of most widely used insulin varieties have risen for over 1,400%. This chart shows the absurd increases in the list price or the price paid by wholesalers for two common insulin products in recent years. To help alleviate the effects of this blatant price gouging, the governor recommends capping copayments for a month's supply of insulin at $50. The governor also proposes several innovative and effective policy solutions to reduce the price of prescription drugs and ensure Wisconsinites can access and afford needed medications by controlling costs, increasing transparency and oversight, strengthening consumer protections, and bolstering programs designed to support Wisconsin's most vulnerable. Our next slide dives into our mental health investments. The stress of COVID-19 pandemic and economic downturn have definitely highlighted the need for more behavioral health crisis care, better access, and more preventative supports. And to ensure the right supports are available at the right time for all Wisconsin residents, we are building an integrated behavioral health system that provides prevention, intervention, and treatment services to individuals across their lifespan in their communities. We also want to create hard of hearing and deaf-blind program that will ensure everyone has access to the mental health care they need. The dedicated providers in this program are aware of the culturally unique difficulties experienced by these individuals. Also, our region has seen a decrease in the availability of emergency mental health beds, while the number of individuals in need has increased. Without these facilities in every region of the state, many Wisconsinites cannot access services within their own communities. Friends or family who may be experiencing a mental health crisis should not have to be transported across the state by law enforcement to Winnebago for emergency detention, which is really the only place to go right now. That is why I support the governor's plan to develop up to 2 regional crisis centers and 5 regional crisis stabilization facilities. And how that'll happen and how that will work is it'll reduce law enforcement time dedicated to emergency detention situations. It'll support individuals within their own communities, allowing them to maintain social connections and serve people of all ages across the state, and also assist adults who are in crisis for those requiring short-term crisis stabilization by providing less traumatic, community-based care in the least restrictive setting and reduce the need for future, more intensive care. Also, what's really important is room and board for residential substance abuse treatment. Wisconsin Medicaid now reimburses for substance use treatment services, but not room and board provided in residential facilities. This is because federal law prohibits federal Medicaid payments for room and board outside of institutional settings. So these charges may be cost prohibitive for Medicaid members, and that means many Wisconsinites cannot get the treatment they need. Currently, some counties cover these costs, but not all counties are able to do so. which results in uneven and inequitable availability of services. By funding these room and board costs with state dollars, Medicaid members around the state will be able to access the new treatment benefit. And the forensic assertive community treatment program is an intervention bridging the behavioral health and criminal justice systems. It will help individuals with serious mental illness who are involved with the criminal justice system by improving clients' mental health outcomes, reducing recidivism, actually addressing individuals' mental health needs while holding them accountable, and managing costs by reducing reoccurring arrest, incarceration, and hospitalization while increasing public safety. The next slide talks about long-term care investments. And the governor's strong investments in his last budget were a success. And I'm excited to share some of the findings and recommendations of the governor's task force on long-term care that are included in this budget. The maps below show percentage of each county's population estimated to be over 64 from 2015 to 2040 on the right. As you can see by the large increases in dark blue counties, our state is aging rapidly, especially in rural areas, and also dealing with higher levels of poverty and health concerns. It also shows the importance of long-term care investments. Wisconsin has lost over 6,600 nursing home beds over the past 8 years from closures and downsizing. And rural Wisconsin has especially suffered. Many of our parents or grandparents that have entered long-term care facilities are far from the place they grew up because local nursing homes have closed their doors. Medicaid funds the majority of residents in nursing homes, but current Medicaid rates only cover about 72% of the cost of caring for each resident. By increasing the Medicaid reimbursement rates, Medicaid will cover 86% of the cost of resident care, and this will make the rate consistent with current reimbursement rates from other residential care, such as rehabilitation hospitals. Medicaid reimbursement rates will see an 11.5% increase in fiscal year 2022, with an additional 11.7% increase in 2023. Well, supporting family caregivers is critically important. The vast majority of caregivers in Wisconsin are family members. Retaining the direct care workforce, caregivers are in need of more support. Budget invests over $200 million to support family caregiving by creating a caregiving tax credit of up to $500 per caregiver through the Department of Revenue. And ADRCs, that's the Aging and Disability Resource Centers that every county has, are an essential resource for community members to get accurate information on aging or living with a disability. These organizations serve our state's fastest growing demographic. The funding method of ADRCs has not been revised in over a decade. Funding has not increased since 2006, which is why we need to expand caregiving support services to address the needs of caregivers of adults with disabilities, the Tribal Aging and Disability Resources, and the Tribal Disability Benefit Specialist Program. Also expand the Dementia Care Specialist Program statewide, along with supporting our more caregivers by expanding the Alzheimer's Family Caregiver Support Program. Our next slide will dive into what's best for kids. So let's talk about the governor's education plan. As a former educator, Governor Evers knows what's best for kids is what's best for our state. This has been a tough year for students, teachers, and parents. The inequities that exist in our school system are on full display as communities struggle to meet the needs of students with limited resources and significant safety concerns. Districts have dealt with a lack of broadband access, teacher shortages, outdated and unsafe school facilities. As we look to bounce back from this pandemic, funding our schools is the best investment we can make to ensure we come out of these challenging times stronger than ever. And thanks to Governor Evers' leadership, our state is finally back on track to meet the 2/3 funding commitment that was first established in the mid-1990s. This budget invests $613 million more into K-12 general aid, the biggest increase in more than 15 years. It'll help students with special needs by providing a $710 million increase for special education aid, and it targets additional resources to help rural districts hold the line on property taxes and promote the mental health and well-being of students. And overall, this budget includes a $1.6 billion spending increase for public and private schools, the most ever. And this funding is badly needed. For years, local property taxpayers have been asked to step in and pick up the tab because the state didn't make school funding a priority. We all understand the value of a quality education and the fact that many of these local school referenda in recent years passed with overwhelming support, proving that our communities understand the importance of quality education. However, forcing districts to rely on these referenda year after year can exacerbate funding disparities and create more inequity in our school system. If the state keeps its commitment, we can guarantee a top-notch education for every child, regardless of how rich or poor their community is. Geography should not predict the outcome for education. Our next slide is what's best for kids in fair funding. Digging into the educational proposal a little more, you can see how new funding is targeted to meet the challenges facing school districts. Many of these solutions to address inequalities in the funding formula are not new ideas. Governor Evers has been talking about this for a long time. So his budget focuses our resources where they will have the biggest impact. That means modernizing our school facilities and the formula we use to fund education, while addressing the greatest needs of children who are most at risk of falling behind, and providing assistance to strengthen our rural schools, while limiting the need for districts to go to referenda to raise property taxes time and time again. The next slide is about ensuring safe and affordable, high-quality childcare. This goes hand in hand with our investment into our future generations. The Birth to Three program is administered by DHS to help serve children with developmental delays and disabilities. And there was a question about this while we read through the slides, but according to the Department of Children and Families, an estimated 54% of Wisconsin residents live in a child care desert. A lack of equitable child care access and quality ECE options across the state is having fundamentally negative impacts on Wisconsin's families, its workforce, and the economy as a whole. Finding affordable and quality child care can be one of the biggest hurdles getting and keeping a job, and bolstering support for this industry will prove critical as Wisconsin begins its post-pandemic recovery. This is how we bounce back. And justice, reform, and reinvestment is critical as well. The TAD program expansion, which increases investments in the successful Treatment, Alternatives, and Diversions program, provides an additional $15 million in GPR and 2.0 full-time equivalent GPR positions in fiscal year 22 to 23 to expand the Treatment, Alternatives, and Diversion program. When an individual calls 911 to request help with a mental health crisis, whether it be on their own or a friend or a neighbor's, they need experts at de-escalation, experts at working with individuals under the influence or under psychological duress. They don't need armed, uniformed law enforcement. This budget provision will create a program to expand the capacity of behavioral crisis lines that provide an alternative to 911 for non-emergency behavioral health issues. And we also want to better align our justice system with appropriate standards for youth by raising the age of adult jurisdiction to 18 and reimbursing counties for some of these increased costs. Also, we want to eliminate automatic original adult court jurisdiction for all youth under the age of 18. On top of that, we need to require that any firearm transfers be done through federally licensed firearm dealers with background checks conducted on recipients. We also need to create an extreme risk protection injunction procedure where a court, after a hearing, may order an individual to refrain from possessing a firearm if it finds by clear and convincing evidence that they are substantially likely to injure himself or herself or another by possessing that firearm. The DOJ, that's the Department of Justice, would, in addition to checking for prohibitions under current law, check whether an applicant for a license to carry a concealed weapon is prohibited from possessing a firearm under that extreme risk protection injunction. And also, along with that, we want to establish that requesting an applicant for employment to supply information regarding their conviction record or otherwise considering the record prior to selection for an interview constitutes employment discrimination. Our next slide invests in higher education. This governor's budget definitely reflects the priority we provide by providing the largest increase to the university system in over 20 years, investing significant funding in student supports. The state will begin by investing more GPR dollars in the UW system than the Department of Corrections, as I had noted earlier. The governor believes every kid should have access to high-quality public education from early childhood programs to our universities and technical college systems. So the governor's budget reflects this priority by providing the largest increase to the university system in over 20 years, as I mentioned earlier, investing significant funding in student supports and increasing funding for the Wisconsin Technical College system by over 17%. The governor recommends continued investment in our state's excellent technical college so they can continue to provide critical services to the 286,000 students that currently serve and to our state's employers in providing training for our skilled workforce. This budget will further increase state general aid for Wisconsin Technical College system institutions by $18 million in each year of the biennium. Our next slide tackles the unemployment crisis that we have been hit with this past year. Our chart, though, depicts Wisconsin's April unemployment rates from 2000 to 2020. Green bar shows the unemployment rate increase during the Great Recession, and the red bar shows, you can see the state's unemployment rate spiked from a season of record lows to recession-level highs because of COVID-19. The pandemic caused the fastest spike in unemployment insurance claims in at least 20 years, far exceeding the Great Recession, which had then prompted an unsuccessful effort to upgrade the unemployment insurance benefits and tax systems. This extreme spike in claims strained the resources and information technology systems of almost every state in the nation, including Wisconsin. To give you a clearer picture, between 2016 and 2019, DWD, the Department of Workforce Development, handled 7.2 million claims. That's between 2016 to 2019. But since March 2020, DWD received over 8.8 million claims alone. That's since March of this year. 1.6 million more claims than the previous 4 years combined. After years of neglect and repeated audits preceding his administration highlighted the system's failures, and the governor's budget rights the wrongs that have gone unaddressed for more than a decade and provides other investments to help our economy recover as quickly as possible in light of the continuation of the pandemic. In particular, this budget modernizes the state's antiquated unemployment system, supports training for individuals, businesses, and organizations affected by COVID-19 by providing $500,000 in each year to support grants to train individuals in green jobs, those that benefit the environment or conserve natural resources. We also would set aside $250,000 in each year to expand youth apprenticeship opportunities, which expose high school students to the unemployment prospects available in the trades. Now we move into transportation in the next frame here. So the governor builds on the sustainable foundation created in his last budget by focusing on targeted program increases while staying within historic lows in bonding for highway projects. The budget addresses the critical needs of Wisconsin's highway system by including an inflationary increase to maintain the purchasing power of the state highway rehabilitation program. And with the investments in the state highway rehabilitation program, we would be able to improve and maintain existing highways, state bridges, and backbone rehabilitation. I have also heard from a lot of constituents who are doing their part to reduce emissions by driving an electric or hybrid vehicle, but who have felt frustrated by increased vehicle registration fees. So Wisconsin is going to use those funds to build out Wisconsin's electric vehicle charging network to ensure that drivers, regardless of power source, can travel throughout the state without worry. This new program invests $5 million to build electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and also to ensure that all persons residing in Wisconsin can access jobs and are qualified to operate a vehicle. The governor recommends the issuance of driver's licenses and identification cards to any person residing in Wisconsin, regardless of documented status, and also drops our debt ratio from 19% high in 2016 of our transportation debt to 17% by the end of the 21-23 budget. This change I would also like to brag a little bit that the governor wants to adopt my idea to help towns with the Department of Transportation. This change helps towns save large amounts of aid due to simple errors. The next slide talks about voting accessibility. So over the past several years, Republicans have created a lot of new roadblocks to suppress voters and make it harder to vote, while Democrats have tried to make it easier for people to vote and support the hard work of our election officials. Republicans' efforts to create chaos at the polls culminated this past fall, and we need to take major steps to simplify elections and restore voting rights. 20 states have already passed automatic voter registration reforms where voters are automatically registered to vote wherever they update their address with the DMV. Like other states, the governor's proposal will help to keep our voter registration rolls up to date while reducing the bureaucratic barriers of registering voters. Additionally, clerks would be allowed to canvass absentee ballots prior to Election Day to help avoid the reporting delays we saw this past November. This is something many counties and municipalities have been asking for, whereas we've been seeing the number of absentee voters increase over the years. Lastly, the governor's budget would expand the absentee voting window and restore local control. Critical pieces in a working government. Our next slide is again about working government, and this is about redistricting reform. I'll be picking up the torch this session by reintroducing the nonpartisan redistricting reform bill because voters should choose their legislators, not the other way around. Wisconsin's legislative districts are drawn every 10 years by utilizing the U.S. Census Bureau data, and this data was supposed to be available to states in April this year, but COVID-19 caused a delay, so maps won't be started until October. Well, Republicans are already gearing up for a fight, and they will be using our tax dollars to cling to power. Since January of this year, Republicans have already started paying $30,000 a month to hire law firms to draw their maps later this year. When the maps end up in court, Republicans will start spending $200,000 a month to fight against the public. These slick attorneys will be charging taxpayers $375 an hour just to keep Republicans in charge of the legislature. And let's not let them get away with signing documents that say they will their allegiance to this private law firm rather than to you. The next slide talks about broadband expansion, one of my favorite topics. The first priority when I became senator in 2019 was introducing legislation to fix flaws in our broadband expansion program and craft new policies for getting high-speed internet to areas that internet service providers will not be profitable in. Well, I introduced 7 bills last session. None of them received a public hearing, nor were they even considered by Republicans. In fact, I tried to even amend a bill last session, and the majority leader, before tabling it, even said vocally and publicly that these are good ideas, but that's not how it's working while we are gerrymandered. And so with that said, I'm hopeful that Republicans this year will have seen the error in their ways and during the pandemic and understand how important broadband expansion is to rural Wisconsin. I will reintroduce these bills if we cannot see progress on this issue going forward. The governor, though, has made this the year of broadband, and I'm really excited about that. In the next slide, we will see that in addition to the huge financial commitment to broadband expansion that Governor Evers wants to make, policy changes to help too. He has, by the way, introduced $200 million investment into broadband expansion, and also redefines unserved and underserved areas so municipalities can participate in the grant program without having to submit a joint application with a private internet service provider. He also strengthens consumer protection so companies cannot discriminate who gets service and who doesn't. So you'll see in the charts that the broadband expansion program will be receiving a major increase in the governor's budget, as I mentioned. The Internet Assistance Program is desperately needed, and supports libraries and schools by adding $3 million to the Teach It infrastructure grant program. It also will have a new line of extension program, which would offer $4,000 to homeowners with long driveways to receive broadband access. The Broadband Leadership and Planning Grant Program would provide technical expertise and grant program guidance to committees wanting to expand broadband in their communities. And the Granular Mapping Data Program will help Public Service Commission better understand who has broadband and who needs it. And finally, with the huge amount of broadband expansion grants, more staff will be needed to administer the program and prevent delays when getting broadband expansion dollars to communities. Next, we want to talk about agriculture. And to keep families farming, the governor creates new programs and bolsters successful programs. And here's what's new. I'm sure you all remember going to the grocery store last year and seeing empty shelves in the meat department. This problem has been brewing for a while. In fact, only 4 companies in the nation control the majority of meat processing nationally, and only 50 processing plants supply our entire nation with 98% of our meat. COVID-19 forced many plants to cease operations, which led to major shortages. The governor adds $1 million to modernize processing facilities and train new employees. He also adds another 6 inspectors at DATCAP to ensure quality meats are produced and no delays are caused by the state, so not being able to do necessary meat inspection. And the governor creates a new farm to fork program to help link up non-educational cafeterias with local farms. The governor also adds more funding to establish and proven programs like Farm to Schools, Buy Local, Buy Wisconsin, and Something Special from Wisconsin. Our next slide goes into marijuana and rural development. Well, let's face it, at the end of the day, people in our communities are using marijuana. Shocked? Are you shocked by that? Well, legalizing, regulating, and taxing marijuana will make our state safer and provide opportunities to our rural communities and farmers. I like to quote my colleague, Senator Agard, when saying the most dangerous thing about marijuana today is that it's illegal. And that is absolutely true. We need to regulate it to make it safe. a total of 36 states, District of Columbia, Guam, Puerto Rico, and U.S. Virgin Islands have approved comprehensive, publicly available medical marijuana programs. Wisconsin would join 15 other states to already legalize recreational marijuana, including neighboring states of Illinois and Michigan. A majority of Wisconsinites support this measure. In 2019, 59% of Wisconsinites supported the legalization of recreational marijuana. 83% of Wisconsinites supported medical marijuana. 83%. Well, under this proposal, marijuana would be taxed like alcohol and could generate over $163 million annually, starting in the 2023 fiscal year. More than $34 million would support school aid for small and rural school districts in the governor's proposal. Well, farmers also need options, and the national market for cannabis continues to grow exponentially. With Illinois and Michigan already allowing marijuana, Minnesota is soon to follow, and that leaves Iowa as Wisconsin's only neighboring state that does not allow the use of marijuana. People are using marijuana, and we owe it to our farmers to give them a new opportunity to grow a safe product for an already reliable market. Our next slide, we want to address clean water and the environment. Well, the biggest headline for Governor's Plan for Environment is the historic investment in the Knowles-Nelson Stewardship Program. As you can see in the graph in the lower left-hand corner, the $70 million per year reauthorization would be a huge investment for purchasing new land, improving the lands we have, and protecting the unique areas of Wisconsin. Up above, you can see the governor renews his call for clean water in Wisconsin by adding another $40 million to help with replacing lead lateral service lines. Also add 11 new staff for PFAS monitoring and testing. To stop nitrate pollution, the governor adds $7 million in bonding for soil and water resource management program for farmers. He'd also add another $6.5 million in bonding for the Target Runoff Management Program to help municipalities prevent water pollution too. Also up the cap for the popular producer-led watershed grant program by $1 million. And the $1 million for 2021 and 2022 will help homeowners improve their drinking water with the Well Compensation Assistance Program. An entire PowerPoint presentation could be put together with all the governor's environmental investments and changes. His stewardship investment is one of a kind, and he also focused on climate change as well. We all know in western Wisconsin that storms are becoming more common and more severe. Flooding has ravaged our communities. The governor adds $12 million in flood control bonding and $1 million for better flood mapping. He also incorporated 35 new policies crafted by the governor's Climate Change Task Force. I recently replaced retired Senator Mark Miller on the task force, and I look forward to working with my colleagues on even more climate change policies down the road. And lastly, the governor doubles the focus on energy contribution rate for utility companies from 1.2% to 2.4% to fund more energy conservation projects for businesses and homeowners. Now let's finally talk about my priorities. Well, again, I think this budget does a great job highlighting the needs of our communities and making smart investments in our future. And you can see a checklist right down the line of the things that I think that we should be focused on. Top priorities I'd like to see in a final product at the end of the day. So finally, the timeline for our budget. Split government will affect this timeline, and we are not sure whether the GOP-controlled legislature will seek to work with Governor Evers or not. Although we've learned that when we work together, we actually get things done. But key Republican leaders have already indicated they plan to ignore much of the governor's proposals rather than try to work toward our shared goals. So the budget is supposed to be done by July 1st, but it may be delayed if compromise can't be reached. So I want to thank you. Please share this information with your friends and families, and I want to hear from you throughout this process. Please keep in touch with me with any thoughts or suggestions as we continue the budget process. Again, thank you.